The Ancient Assyrian History of Conquest and Destruction. Essentially, what did they conquer, and what did they do with said conquered territories? So the first conquest the Assyrians ever embarked on, um, after being ruled by the Babylonians and the Mitannis, uh, were actually the old territories of the Mitannis, as they were collapsing due to internal strife and general just authority issues and governing issues. The person who led these conquests was Ashur-uballit the First. Uh, he was the first real Assyrian king that wasn't um, working for a foreign power or for their own personal gain. Uh, or let me rephrase that. They weren't working for a foreign power. He still was very eccentric, as most emperors at the time were, but he was very focused more on conquering and governing these new territories rather than just conquering or just governing. He also conquered Nineveh, which was a very prestigious city at the time, but he did sack it. Um, how bad the sack was, we don't know. There aren't any serious records of it, but we do know that it was sacked and that a lot of people were killed during said sack. Uh, the end of his rule was marked with an alliance with Kassite successors of Babylonia, and with this alliance, um, they crushed both Hittite and the Hurrian kingdoms, which were both relatively small and insignificant powers at this time period. This is an artist's interpretation of Nineveh. It was written, was painted in 1853 by Sir Austin Henry Layward. Um, this is the Assyrian palaces. So this isn't what Nineveh looked like before it was conquered. Um, but this is how it stayed until the end of Assyrian rule, when no one was building or funding these great palaces. But actually, these palaces were the construction started under Ashur-uballit the First, but they continued until all the way to the end of the empire. Uh, most of the palaces did. So it was a very long construction process. This was like during the peak of the Middle Assyrian period. So at the peak of its prosperity and the both economically and politically. After a few more kings, and after Ashur-uballit the First had passed away and fallen out of power, Adad-nirari the First, who ruled from 1305 to 1274 BC, um, took over. He was very similar to Ashur-uballit the First in that he was very heavy on conquest and destruction while also still being a relatively decent governor. Um, Nirari the First would conquer the rest of the Mitanni kingdom. Specifically, the one that we have the most records of is the conquering of Taidu, and in his own words, he sowed salt over Taidu, so we can assume that it was sacked, if not burnt to the ground, to be made completely uninhabitable, or just generally completely useless to anyone else other than the Assyrians, or really just as a show of power. Um, After these conquests of the Mitanni and the Mitanni capital and the Mitanni kingdom total, he basically stopped conquests and instead focused on uh, reorganizing the kingdom and just getting things in order for those to come after him. This is a map of the Middle Assyrian Empire, basically the what it was in about 1250 BC. The map says it's 1200 BC, but Babylonia was conquered by the Assyrians by 1207 BC, so this is not an accurate map. Uh, but this would be what the Assyrians would look like a little bit after the rule of Adad Nirari the First. Uh, so you can see Taidu right there. It was conquered, as I said before, but all this land was either uh, Atani land or tribal land that the Assyrians took over either through trade deals or marital agreements. Uh, and these were the last conquests of the Middle Assyrian Empire. After this, the Assyrian Empire would enter an era of stagnation, a long period of time. But for all until about 1114 BC, or in other words, the rule of Tiglath-Pileser the First, most of the kings focused on internal issues, trade, and alliances rather than conquest. Tilgath specifically did not like this. Went on many conquests, conquering everything from the Arabian Desert, the coasts of modern Syria, Lebanon, and southern Turkey. He did, but after basically this eruption of conquest, he halted them and instead focused on fortifying, reorganizing these areas to better suit the Assyrians' needs. Tilgath-Pileser I never personally encountered or fought the Sea People, but he clashed with the Aramaeans, people displaced by said Sea People. Again, Assyrian Empire went into an era of relative stagnation until circa 1883 BC, after the end of Tilgath-Pileser's the first reign. This is a map of the Assyrian Empire's territorial extent in 1824 BC and 671 BC. This is not accurate to what stagnation looked like, as this is actually a little bit afterwards, about 60 years. The area during the stagnation that the Assyrians controlled was the area essentially from Nineveh to Ashur to Babylonia. They controlled most of the Tigris River, but they did not control much outside of that due to lack of funds and lack of military power. And these would be the final moments of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the last real hurrah. It was the rule of Ashurnapar, however the hell you say that, second's rule, and that lasted from circa 1883 to 1859 BC. He really started the reconquests, mainly of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and southern Turkey, basically taking it back, as this map shows, basically all the dark green. That's what he conquered. And it was, it did bring a decent amount of wealth to the empire, but it was also very costly military manpower and just to fund everything and to get everything running into shape. His successors would do similar things, but they were much more slow expanders rather than quick expanders. The most notable of his successors was Ashardon, ruled from circa 680 to 669 BC. He conquered Egypt, which was a very prestigious thing to do at the time, still is to an extent. After the conquering of Egypt, he put puppet emperors in control of a lot of the areas the Assyrians once ruled over directly. So, like, Israel, Egypt, Babylonia, he put puppet emperors. But most, if not all, of these emperors were either overthrown by their local population during the decline of the Assyrian Empire, or joined on the side of the people who actively rebelled against the Assyrians in a war. The absolute end of the Assyrian Empire was in 612 BC, but it continued to hold on to the lifeline until 609 BC, when it officially, completely, and utterly collapsed. In 612 BC, you had the Battle of Nineveh, which was when the Assyrian king Shunsakurasan was either killed or exiled during the battle, and this battle specifically was against the rebelling puppets, and those specifically against the Babylonians, as they had risen up in a Neo-Babylonian empire and had allied themselves with many of the other empires around the area. We don't know how many people died from the Assyrians, but at least 100,000. judging on battle reports, all that. But that's just from the battle reports. We don't know how many civilians were killed, displaced, or uh, just treated horribly. All in all, it's probably safe to say at least 1 million people suffered under the foot of the Assyrians. And it's also very important to note that the Assyrian Empire was very brutal. Uh, it oftentimes engaged in deportation tactics. In fact, that was one of the main things that they did. They also engaged in huge amounts of slavery. They were basically what you would call the precursor to an ancient ISIS, if that makes any sense. They were very. They were essentially a terrorist organization with the backing of a state. That is the best way to describe it. And even by ancient times, they were very brutal and outright did not care for its citizens at times. Thank you. This is my PowerPoint. I know it was relatively short, but I feel like it covers most of the military history of Assyria, even if it doesn't go into great detail. I only had so much time for this presentation, and I didn't want to take up 90 minutes. So, thank you for watching. Uh, have a nice day.